Hello and welcome to the Greater Washington Community Foundation's 2020 VoicesDMV Community Insights Survey Data Briefing webinar. My name is Benton Murphy and I'm currently Associate Vice President for Community Investment at the Greater Washington Community Foundation. I'm joined on this webinar by Grant Buckles, Senior Research Consultant with Gallup, who's served as our fantastic survey partner for our 2020 Voices Survey. In just a few minutes, Grant will be sharing highlights from our VoicesDMV Community Insights Survey. VoicesDMV is a community listening initiative designed to help the Community Foundation keep a finger on the pulse of the community by deeply and authentically listening to the voices, experiences, attitudes, and perceptions of people who live here, especially across jurisdictions. Through VoicesDMV, we have committed to engaging our community every few years to ensure our information stays fresh and that we continue to listen to voices in our community which are generally not heard from in philanthropy. In 2017, our first VoicesDMV survey revealed deep disparities in income and opportunity, preventing many of our neighbors from accessing their region's economic growth and prosperity. Our 2020 Community Insight Survey asked many of the same questions from 2017 to provide us with longitudinal information on how attitudes and perceptions have shifted in the past few years. We also asked new questions on topics that have impacted our community since 2017, including the impact of the 2019 government shutdowns. Both the 2017 and 2020 survey reports are available online at www.voicesdmv.org. There you will also find an interactive data visualization tool provided by our project partner MySidewalk that offers an interactive way to learn about the survey data. I'll note that the 2020 survey offers a snapshot and insight into how the region looked and felt in the months immediately preceding the COVID-19 pandemic and the massive civil unrest following the killing of George Floyd. Even before these crises, much of our region was struggling. Nearly 1 in 5 of our neighbors reported that they could only make it by for less than 1 month if they lost their current sources of household income. Even more worrisome, nearly 1/3 of residents reported being very or slightly worried about being able to pay their rent or mortgage on a good day. Now, as we face the ongoing impact of the pandemic and systemic racism, these statistics are a stark reality for many. We're seeing this play out with devastating effect as our region's low-income households and communities of color are being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. I'll say that in addition to our survey report, the Community Foundation dives into these inequities in greater detail in a companion piece to the report entitled Charting a New Path Forward. It's also available at www.voicesdmv.org. As we begin to look beyond responding to the immediate crisis at hand, our region's recovery cannot be a return to the status quo as previously captured by our survey. While the sentiments expressed by respondents in the survey have certainly shifted in these last few tumultuous months, the data provide us with signals for what we can do differently as we work toward rebuilding a more equitable and resilient region. We all have a role to play in shaping a new normal as a community that offers equal opportunity for all residents to thrive. We plan to follow this survey release with a series of interactive online discussions that center on how we can work together to improve our region moving forward. So please do stay tuned to more from the Community Foundation on our VoicesDMV effort. With that, I'll hand it off to Grant to provide us with the data briefing. Thank you, Grant.
Thank you, Ben, for that excellent introduction. And it has been our pleasure at Gallup to partner with the Greater Washington Community Foundation on this project. So first, before we dive into some of the findings, I'd like to provide a little bit of context about how we developed this project in partnership with the Greater Washington Community Foundation, and give you a little bit of details about our methodology for the survey and some context about how the questionnaire was developed. So first, we developed the questionnaire in partnership with the Greater Washington Community Foundation staff, including board members, as well as members of the Community Investment Committee. As part of the project, we wanted to base the findings on the great work that the Community Foundation has already done, particularly related to the Building Thriving Communities framework. So we wanted to tie the individual indicators in the survey to this important framework that was developed to focus on 3 main areas. These are listed here on this slide. The first is addressing poverty, which is obviously a key component to any element of community well-being. You have to look at poverty and the ways in which you can address poverty through partnerships, through grants, etc. And so we wanted to provide a more complete picture of the state of poverty and financial well-being in the Greater Washington region. Beyond that, we also looked at deepening culture and human connection. So going beyond just the individual lived experiences, but also how individuals are connecting with each other, how residents are engaged in their community and involved in their community and contributing to not only their individual neighborhoods, but also the region as a whole. So this is some unique data on the civic involvement of residents and find out really how much they are contributing as individuals and connecting with each other. And then lastly, as we well know, given all of the economic transformations, both before and after the COVID-19 pandemic, every region in the United States is going to have to prepare for the future of work. The nature of work is changing rapidly. And so we wanted to look at some of the barriers to finding good jobs in the greater Washington region. And so we've developed some specific questions that capture this in a unique way. So beyond these core survey themes, we developed over 115 indicators in the survey that really provide a comprehensive view of life in the greater Washington region. So the survey does include a mix of 2017 VoicesDMV survey questions, which were used, as Ben mentioned, for trending purposes. And on top of that, we developed some new questions specifically focusing on housing and homelessness, since that is one of the key challenges in the greater Washington region. We also looked at questions on childcare and the 2019 government shutdown, among others. So this is considered an extension of the 2017 survey, but also breaking new ground and covering new topics that were initially unexplored. So we're excited to share some of these new indicators as well. So this slide also just provides a brief summary of the sections of the survey. So to give you an idea of how we collected the data, we did a mail-based survey using address-based sampling, which provides the most complete coverage of all the different survey methods, sampling methods that we could have used. We wanted to make sure everyone was included in the survey as possible. Obviously, we can't reach 100% coverage, no survey can, but we saw the address-based sampling as the most complete approach to reach everyone in the region. And so we sent surveys to a random sample of households that were representative of the greater Washington region. This includes District of Columbia, Montgomery County, and Prince George's County in Maryland, Fairfax County, Loudoun County, and then we combined Alexandria and Arlington County, which also includes results from cities of Fairfax and Falls Church. So this represents a slight expansion from the 2017 survey as well, by including Loudoun County. So all data was weighted to adjust for unequal non-response by geography and key demographic groups. So all results in this survey shown here today can be considered representative based on this approach. So it ended up being an 8-page survey booklet that we mailed to all of the sampled households, over 13,000 in total. And we sent those out in late November and early January. And these included both English and Spanish surveys to be as inclusive as possible. And then we ended up with close to 1,700 completed surveys, which represents a great cross-section of the region. As I mentioned, this included a paper survey, but also we provided individuals with a bit of background on the Greater Washington Community Foundation and the VoicesDMV initiative. So we wanted everyone to not only fill out the survey, but feel involved and learn more about the initiative. Before we proceed to some of the in-depth findings from the survey, I wanted to provide a little bit of overview of who actually completed the survey, because that's obviously an important component of any survey, is who's providing inputs who's providing inputs from the questions that we asked. And as I mentioned, we weighted the survey across a number of key demographics, but we're not able to account for everything. So I think it's important to show some key demographic variables here. So this shows the cross-section of the area of residence from all the respondents. So as you can see, we had Fairfax County, which is the largest jurisdiction in the region, represents about a quarter of the results. We had good representation across all jurisdictions, though. And we are able to, based on the number of completes that we received, provide rigorous findings and results from each individual jurisdiction. So we reached a strong reporting threshold for each one, which was a positive to the sampling approach. In terms of key demographics, we had a strong diversity of respondents in terms of race. We had 43% were white, 28% Black, 16% Hispanic, and 12% Asian. But we also, beyond race, had a diversity of experiences and history in the region. So we had a lot of new residents in the greater Washington region. So almost a quarter have been in the greater Washington region for less than 6 years. We also had almost a quarter who've been here for over 40 years. So we had a strong representation across different levels of experience and life experience in the greater Washington region as well. Just to provide you a little bit of a deeper dive by each jurisdiction, you can see that race obviously varies by region depending on the local population. And several of the jurisdictions, Alexandria and Arlington and Fairfax County, we had half or more as white residents. But as you can see, Prince George's County is 69% Black residents. DC is also over majority non-white as well. So each county and each jurisdiction provides a unique demographic group. So it's important to keep that in mind when reporting on each of these jurisdictions throughout the survey. In terms of the final key demographics I wanted to highlight, as you know, the greater Washington region is one of the most educated in the United States. So we did have a lot of individuals with higher education degrees represented in the survey. We had a quarter with a bachelor's degree, and then right at a quarter with a graduate degree or more. And then we had 15% had less than a high school diploma. So this provides you with a little bit of context around the level of education in the region. We did have a nice cross-section, but as you can see, the DC region is one of the more highly educated. But that does not take away some of the issues with education and job preparation, as we'll talk about later. And then lastly, we have a large variation in household income, ranging from 5% had less than $12,000 per year in household income, and then around 11% had $240,000 or more. And as you can see, each of these little brackets, we had pretty strong distribution across these different income brackets. So I think that's another important thing to keep in mind, is that we're really capturing a large number of walks of life in terms of economic experiences too. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we structured the survey around 3 major themes from the Building Thriving Communities framework. And the first is addressing poverty. So the first set of results I'd like to share deals specifically with that. The first is specifically around homelessness. And as many people know anecdotally, this is a challenge in the region. But we found for the first time that 1/3 of all Washington area residents personally know someone who has experienced homelessness or who is at risk of becoming homeless. So that is, I think, a pretty staggering finding, that 1/3 of every resident in the region knows someone who has experience with homelessness. And this was before the COVID-19 pandemic, in which we know that people are having trouble paying mortgages, paying rent, and this is an issue that will continue to worsen in the short term and perhaps the long term. So I think this is important context to keep in mind, that even prior to the pandemic, we had 1/3 of all residents had some type of personal experience or relationship with homelessness. The areas that had the highest number of residents reporting personal experiences with homelessness were Prince George's County with 38% and Fairfax County with 36%. And the lowest was Montgomery County, but still 1/4 of residents had some type of personal connection to homelessness. The areas with the most residents reporting an increase in homelessness in their area was District of Columbia. So 46% of residents in DC said that there was an increase in homelessness in the area where they live over the past year. And then 44% of Fairfax County residents reported the same. So individuals are reporting an increase in homelessness in their neighborhoods. And then we asked residents not just how they perceive homelessness or how they're connected to it, but what they think that local stakeholders are doing to address homelessness. And we see that 25% of residents believe that they either strongly agree or somewhat agree that their local government cares about addressing homelessness in the area where they live. So only a quarter of residents believe that. Around 50% are in the middle. They neither agree nor disagree. And then another quarter either somewhat disagree or strongly disagree that their local government cares about addressing homelessness. We specifically asked questions about policy proposals as well. So not just whether the local government cares, but what types of policy prescriptions could be used. And we specifically asked about increasing the supply of housing. And this is something that economists often focus on, is increasing the supply of housing will help alleviate some of the homelessness issues and decrease the cost of housing just more generally. We see that only in two regions, that would be Alexandria and Arlington and DC, do a majority of residents think that the solution to homelessness is increasing the supply of housing. Loudoun County is the lowest in that regard, where less than 40% agree that it's a policy solution. But I think what's especially stark here is that right at 60% of residents in DC are willing to pay more taxes to help increase the supply of affordable housing. So there is a demand. People in DC are not only supportive of increasing the supply of housing, but they're also willing to pay more taxes to ensure the supply of affordable housing increases. But that varies by region. Prince George's County is the area where the fewest number of residents support that type of taxation. So I think these are some pretty interesting findings in terms of policy prescriptions. A key component of this study was also trying to figure out priorities for local governments, especially to address poverty. And we asked residents on both surveys to prioritize issues ranging from developing parks to maintaining roads and sidewalks, all the way to improving bicycle safety to preventing discrimination. And what we found across the two surveys, are three main priorities stood out. In terms of the percentage of residents who said that each issue was an extremely high priority, we see that making sure all children get a quality education is the most important. Slightly behind that is protecting people from crime, and then lastly, protecting people from pollution and environmental hazards. So particularly in Loudoun County, we see the education issue is rated the highest, is extremely high priority. But we do see pretty strong consistency across all the jurisdictions in terms of how they rate different issue areas. One of the benefits of conducting the survey in two waves since 2017 and then this year, we can track differences in priorities among residents. And we see that the biggest jump in the percentage of residents the biggest jump for an issue rated extremely high priority by residents is protecting people from pollution and environmental hazards. We saw a 10% increase in the number of residents saying that this was an extremely high priority. And so that's the biggest increase across all the different issue areas. But we also see strong demand for helping individuals who are experiencing homelessness, again, underlying the importance of this challenge to the region and making sure all children get a quality education. So I think these issues, this comparison over time is pretty interesting to see how local policymakers can prioritize different issue areas. And as I mentioned, since we can compare these over time, we do see that there is, however, some stability in the top issues. So over half of all residents still rate protecting people from crime and ensuring a quality education for all children as extremely high priorities. So these are issue areas that have remained salient for 3 years. And it's an area in which residents continue to underline that need to be addressed. So beyond those issue areas, we wanted to look specifically at the economy, since that is strongly related to addressing poverty in the region. So we asked residents, do they think that the overall economic conditions in the Washington area are getting better, getting worse, or staying the same? And the highest number of residents, and obviously this was conducted early in 2020, late 2019, so this is context prior to COVID-19. But the area that was the most optimistic about the economy was Loudoun County. Half of residents said that the overall economic conditions were getting better. This is in pretty stark contrast to Prince George's County, in which less than 25% said that the local economy was getting better. And Prince George's County is actually a jurisdiction in which residents were less optimistic than they were in 2017, despite, at the time, a record strong economy in terms of unemployment and a number of indicators. So even given this strong economy, we do see strong variation in how residents view the overall economic conditions in the Washington area. This is strongly tied to the availability of good jobs as well. So we looked at whether residents felt like the availability of good jobs was excellent, good, poor, and we looked at some other categories as well. We found that almost 80% of Loudoun County residents said that the availability of good jobs in the place where they live was excellent or good. So nearly, I don't want to say everyone, but almost everyone said that had a positive view of the availability of good jobs in their area in Loudoun County, whereas only 37% of Prince George's County residents said the same about their jurisdiction. And so this, we see, despite a really strong economy in the region prior to COVID-19, still there were disparities between individual localities within the region being able to access good jobs. One thing I may show later is that Prince George's County residents also found the most difficulty getting around the region in terms of mobility and accessing public transportation. So not only were the supply of jobs lower in their area, they had trouble accessing good jobs in other parts of the region. So beyond geography, we wanted to look specifically at any racial disparities that may exist and how residents view the local economy. We found big gaps there as well. So white residents and Asian residents had the highest assessment of the local economy earlier this year. So over 35% of white and Asian residents said that the overall economic conditions were getting better in the region. This is compared to 25% of Black residents, or just over 25% of Black residents. And we see only a small increase in how Black residents viewed the local economy from 2017 compared to 2020. And this is in stark contrast to all other racial groups and ethnic groups here, where you saw a big jump between 2017 and 2020 and how residents viewed the local economy. So all other racial groups were more likely to say that the economy was getting better in 2020 compared to what they said in 2017. So that provides a broad snapshot of how the economy is perceived by local residents across different geographies, across different racial groups. And we looked at some specific issue areas there related to homelessness, education, and things of that nature. Moving beyond that, we wanted to look at the human connection, since that is an important component of the Building Thriving Communities framework. And so at the very core of that is basically, how do neighbors relate to one another? So we asked residents, how often do you talk to or visit with your immediate neighbors? And we see that over 30% talk to their neighbors about every day or several times a week. And so we see a strong level of community cohesiveness, which is pretty consistent across all of the different jurisdictions. Another quarter say that they talk to their neighbors several times a month. And very few people are completely isolated. Only 14% say that they never talk to their neighbors. So I think that despite some, views of cities and how people don't really talk to one another, we see that across the region, neighbors are talking to neighbors and fostering that type of community cohesiveness that is a way of attracting new residents. So we see that social connections high, even though most residents have only lived in their current residence for 2 years or less, or 3 to 6 years or less. So despite not having lived in their residence for very long, neighbors are still connecting with one another. And what's most important, this isn't just a feel-good finding. It does have important connections to key outcomes. So we found that using regression analysis, that residents who talk to their neighbor at least once a month are nearly twice as likely to highly recommend the area where they live. So in terms of trying to build strong communities and attract people to different areas of the region, you want neighbors to have that type of connection because they're more likely to recommend new people to move to their area. So I think that's an important finding, that it's not just important for just neighborliness or anything like that, but it's also important to building thriving communities and thriving economies by attracting new residents. We find that Prince George's County is the most connected. 61% of residents speak to their neighbors several times a month or more. In Alexandria and Arlington, our residents have seen the biggest decline in connecting with neighbors, 59% in 2017 versus 43% in 2020. So that's an important trend to keep in mind as well from a jurisdiction perspective. As we all know, this is a region that is undergoing major changes. And so we wanted to ask residents how those changes are affecting them, whether those changes benefit other people, whether they benefit themselves, or whether they generally benefit everyone. And so we look specifically at responses to say, when you think about the changes going on in the place where you live, do you think that those changes are generally benefiting everyone? And we see that Prince George's County is one part of the region in which the vast majority of residents say that the change is generally benefiting everyone. And that's actually an increase over 2017. So while views in Prince George's County of the economy were a little pessimistic, they do see changes happening and that those changes are benefiting everyone. We see Fairfax County having similarly positive evaluations of that change. And the only area in which we see kind of more pessimism about whether change is benefiting everyone is Alexandria and Arlington, where we've seen a drop since 2017. And this could be related to the previous finding I just highlighted, that neighbors really aren't speaking to each other as much, and maybe changes in the level of new residents or different developments or things like that may be changing the nature of communities. And so it's just something to keep an eye on, particularly over time, to see if that level of cohesion and optimism about that jurisdiction continue to decline. And we see in DC a slight dip as well of those who think that change is generally benefiting everyone. And then one key component of all level of human connection is really race relations. DC is a extremely diverse, the Greater Washington region is an extremely diverse region. Each part of the jurisdiction, as we showed earlier, has a diverse number of residents living there. Each jurisdiction is different, but there is a high level of diversity. And so one thing to keep in mind is really how individuals view race relations in their own jurisdiction, and then benchmark that against different other areas, so the Washington region more generally, and then the US as a whole. And so we found that in every single jurisdiction, people rate relations between different ethnic and racial groups higher in the area where they live than they do in the Washington area more generally, and in the US as a whole. And this is something that's really important to keep in mind in our current context, is that Washington area residents are extremely negative about race relations in the US as a whole, but much more positive about their own communities. And excuse me. The area in which we see the highest evaluation of race relations is Loudoun County. We see that over 80% say that race relations are excellent or good. It's very similar in Fairfax County. And then Montgomery County is also fairly positive along that regard. And really the only area where there are some issues compared to other jurisdictions would be DC, in which only 60% rate the relations as good or excellent, especially when you compare it to some of the other jurisdictions. And then Alexandria and Arlington, that's the jurisdiction where you see the lowest evaluation of the US as a whole in terms of this regard. So I think an important takeaway here is that we see strong communities and they're seeing strong race relations locally, but as you move higher up across different levels of geography, it becomes less positive. And that's obviously not, inclusivity is not just related to race. So we wanted to look at how other residents feel in terms of discrimination. We found that 45% of LGBTQ residents, how they feel about discrimination. We found that 45% said that they have been discriminated against in the past year. So that's right at half. So even in a region with, seen as very inclusive, there is some degree of discrimination being perceived by LGBTQ residents. And then we find that nearly 7 in 10 among the residents who felt discriminated against in the past year felt so because of their race. And so that's, again, an extremely large number of residents who see race as a reason for discrimination. So this provides, I think, especially in our current environment, some key data to show how things were prior to a lot of the conversations we're having about race. And it's an important thing to continue to track over time as we continue to try to improve some of these relationships at the local, regional, and national levels. Just continuing on some of this, some of these findings around discrimination, besides social interactions, the most reported situation in which residents felt discriminated against was when they were trying to find a job or at their current job. So that's another thing I think that's important to keep in mind, is that discrimination is happening as residents are working or trying to find a job. And in order to have a thriving economy and to prepare for the future of work, that's something that has to be addressed to make sure that all prospective employees and current employees feel like their workplaces are inclusive and welcoming and non-discriminatory. So related to that, we want to look specifically at the barriers to finding good jobs and some thoughts about how to prepare residents for the future of work. And so the first thing we wanted to look at were the barriers for residents preparing for the future of work and trying to find a good job. So we asked residents across the region, have you personally experienced any of the following barriers to finding and keeping a job? And we found that almost a quarter of residents said that it was their level of education or training. And as I mentioned earlier, the Greater Washington region is one of the most highly educated in the US. And that in itself is a positive, but it's also showing up to be a barrier for some residents finding a good job, because the demand for education is so high and it's so competitive that around a quarter of all residents say that they have trouble finding a job because of their level of education or training. Almost 20% say past work experience is a challenge. And almost as high as convenient public transportation. So that aspect of mobility is also important, because as we showed earlier in these findings, not all parts of the region have equal access to good jobs. And so in order to access those good jobs, you do need convenient public transportation, and that continues to pose a problem for some residents. If you look specifically at those who are unemployed, which, as we know, here in the COVID-19 era, unemployment is even higher than it was earlier this year. Half of those who are unemployed and looking for work cite level of education as a barrier to finding and keeping a good job. On top of that, 40% of the unemployed report past work experience and 37 report convenient public transportation as barriers. So as we look at reconstructing the economy after COVID-19, it's not just education, job training, work experience that we need to focus on, but also looking at mobility as a way of helping the economy recover. On this past slide, and so I'll go back here, over 10% said that access to childcare was also an important barrier to finding a good job. And so we wanted to look at not just childcare, but other benefits and whether individuals have access to different benefits. We see that maternity and paternity leave is available to less than 70% of workers, which has increased over time, but may pose a barrier to parents, new parents, but also, as we just showed, that childcare after the child is born is also a barrier to finding good jobs. We see that health insurance is the largest benefit that is shared among all workers. So we see if you take this data at a very macro level view, it looks very positive. We see benefits available to a large number of people. That's obviously changed over time, but earlier this year there were a large level of benefits and number of benefits available to individuals. But we do see strong variation when we look at specific education levels. So less than half of those who have a high school diploma or less report having maternity or paternity leave. So while you see that high number overall, it's not high for everyone. Less than half of those who have a high school diploma or less have that benefit. So there is some important variation among different groups that's important to keep in mind when trying to prepare everyone for the future of work. We see that 2/3 of parents with children age 5 or younger find it difficult or very difficult to pay for high quality childcare for their child or children. So regardless of income, we're seeing parents having difficulty affording high quality childcare. And so that's even worsened probably in the COVID-19 era, where more people are working from home and child care centers are closed, and it's something to keep in mind as we think about the reconstruction of the economy, is how we address some of these barriers to work around child care specifically. And then lastly, given the importance of the federal government to the region's economy, we wanted to look specifically at the 2019 government shutdown. And so that was a little over a year ago. We wanted to see how that impacted the local economy. And we found that, and I think this is one of the first attempts to capture how the shutdown affected the local economy. We found that 15% of workers were negatively financially impacted by the 2019 government shutdown. And the areas most negatively impacted were Fairfax County, Alexandria, and Arlington, where there was 20% of residents who were negatively financially impacted. And then older workers were disproportionately impacted by the shutdown. You had 21% of workers aged 55 to 64 who faced negative financial consequences, compared to just 5% of workers aged 18 to 24. So there were age differences in how the shutdown impacted workers. But we find that 40% of people who are negatively financially impacted don't actually work for the federal government, which shows how closely tied the local economy is to the federal government. We did find that 19% of workers were a government worker who were furloughed. 8% were government workers who were considered essential and worked without pay. Around a quarter were government contractors who lost out on earnings. And then 10% were business owners who lost out on earnings due to the shutdown. And then, as I mentioned, 40% don't fall into any of those categories, and these are likely ones working for businesses who lost out on earnings, or who think of restaurants or other service industries related to that. And so as government shutdowns have become more frequent over the past decade, this creates challenges for the local philanthropy community to think about how to support workers in this facing these challenges. Okay, so those are the three findings from the three main pillars of the Building Thriving Community framework. On top of that, we wanted to highlight some trends to watch, some data that really stood out to us, changes from 2017 that should impact how policymakers, uh, philanthropies, charities, other organizations think about their local communities and how to support individuals. So we see that the local availability of good jobs is declining despite the strong regional economy earlier in late in 2019 and early 2020. So when we asked residents, or as I mentioned earlier, how would you rate the availability of good jobs in the place where you live, we saw declines from 2017 in all jurisdictions. I will note that Loudoun County was not surveyed in 2017, so that trend is not highlighted here. We see the biggest decline in Prince George's County. We saw a 25% decrease in the number of residents who said that the availability of good jobs was excellent or good in their jurisdiction. But we do see declines in every other jurisdiction as well. So even prior to COVID-19 pandemic, we did see declining availability of good jobs in all of these jurisdictions over time. The next question that I think really stood out to us when looking through the data was how good is the place where you live for the following groups of people? And this is especially important when you think about the conversations we're having about discrimination and inclusivity and trying to build thriving communities more generally. And we see the biggest change in percent change in residents responding very good or good from 2017 to 2020 for non-English speakers. So in 2017, so if you look on the left side of the bar here on the yellow bars, we see that the biggest declines in terms of evaluating individual areas where they live was for non-English speakers. So even in Alexandria and Arlington, we saw a 20% decline in the number of residents who said that the area where they live was very good or good for non-English speakers. And that's pretty stark, but we see declines in every single jurisdiction. Where we do see improvements are in areas such as immigrants from other countries, racial and ethnic minorities. So we see Prince George's County saw a big jump in how residents rated their community for racial and ethnic minorities, almost a right over a 10% increase there. So we do see that region becoming more inclusive according to its residents. And then for women and girls, we see a large increase in Fairfax County, around 5%. And then for religious minorities as well in quite a few jurisdictions. But I think it's pretty interesting to see how individuals are rating the area where they live in terms of inclusivity for each of these different groups. And we see many challenges here, according to residents, for non-English speakers. So while people view their communities largely as more, as better for immigrants from other countries now, that may not apply to immigrants who don't speak English. So I think that's an interesting contrast there between these changes over time. Okay, and the last finding I just wanted to leave everyone with was around, as we know, the importance of local nonprofits and charity organizations locally. This is especially stark given the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Greater Washington Community Foundation has been so involved with making sure that local organizations have the funds to do their important work in their communities. And I think the important thing to highlight here is that 85% of those people prior to the pandemic who received services from nonprofits or charity organizations are very satisfied or somewhat satisfied that the services they received met their needs. So we see almost universal approval ratings for local nonprofit and charity scene locally among the residents who use their services. So that's, I think, an important thing to acknowledge for these organizations doing important work. But we see that their impact can be even greater, and hopefully this data will help local organizations expand their impact because they're playing such a key role at the moment. We find that 28% of those who do not receive any services simply don't know of any nonprofits that serve their needs. So there is an opportunity here for local nonprofits and charity organizations to increase awareness about their services and really make a difference in their communities, because as we see, nearly everyone appreciates and approves of the services they receive and are provided to them. And so we want to make sure that everyone knows about these services locally. So just wanted to highlight this finding to show that these organizations are doing such important work and continue to do important work during COVID-19. And hopefully the use of data, making this report and the individual data available to everyone can only help serve their mission and highlight their important contributions locally. With that, I know there was a lot of data discussed today, so feel free to reach out to the Greater Washington Community Foundation and myself at Gallup, and we're happy to answer any additional questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ben for concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, Grant, for that thorough and very concise presentation. And I know that we only overviewed a very small subset of the fascinating data that's available both in the report, the VoicesDMV Community Insights Survey report, as well as online on our dashboard. So we'd encourage everybody who's watching this webinar to please read the report and look online for additional detail. Also look out for more information and details from the Community Foundation about ways to engage with us around this data. We have a plan to really lift up most of these impactful findings and have a conversation about them online with people on our networks. We want to do good around these indicators in Greater Washington moving forward, and just keep an eye out for more from us on how you can work with us. Again, all of this information, the reports from 2017 and 2020, and hopefully those in 2022 and moving forward, as we have an intent to do this every couple of years, is available on our website at www.voicesdmv.org. And I'll just close by saying thank you again to you, Grant and Gallup, for your excellent work on this project. And we look forward to engaging many of you in Greater Washington on VoicesDMV in the near future. Thanks all, and that will conclude today's webinar.